Hello everyone. So I thought that while this patch is still up, it might be interesting to do a patch breakdown video about this track. This is one of the rare instances where I know already once this track is done, I'm gonna probably release it on my own label on cassette. I guess when the video will be out, the track will be out. The idea behind this track breakdown is to go a bit further back in time, contrary to the last track breakdown, which only focused about the computer part. Here we'll start from the very beginning, from the modular, the drum machine, and how I create the sounds, and then how I process them into the computer to finish the track. So this track has a fun history. I was asked by one of my Patreon supporters to create a track live while we were doing the Zoom meeting. Usually you spend like 4 hours noodling on your computer and with VST and the modular as well, plugging cables in and out, nothing comes out. So I thought, yeah, okay, let's do that. But I was hoping that something would come out within an hour. I guess I was lucky because I fell upon this nice sequence. I used the drum kit in my Alphabase from a previous track, which translated very well to that one, so that was okay. So the first main sound is the synth sequence, which originates in the voltage multistage. Contrary to most of the time, I left this 8 steps on. You can see the LEDs moving across the entire voltage multistage. And I have step 2, 3, 4, and 8 sending gates. 2, 3, 4 are classic gates, and the 8th is a slide. Different notes here and there. And I'm sending my pitch to contour 1, jaw analog, which I use here as a slew to create some glide in between the notes. The oscillator I'm using is the trusty Red Panel 158. If there's a big jumble of cables here, it's because I'm using the beautiful ALM OA ×2, which is really a perfect pairing with the Red Panel. Of course, you can get the Red Panel module that does exactly the same thing, but it's 12 HP, whereas 4 HP for the ALM module, so it works much better in my case. It's basically a dual offset and attenuator. Extremely simple module, but contrary to most offsets, it can do 8 volts, which is really nice and useful with that module. So I'm sending my pitch information that went through my slew generator, the contour 1, into the OA2, so I can offset that voltage and attenuate that voltage, because remember, the voltage multistage outputs 10 volts, so it's a lot. So you offset the voltage, that means push the oscillator into audio rate, into the Red Panel, and then you attenuate the voltage incoming from the voltage multistage to have somewhat of a musical range. And I'm just offsetting the second oscillator of the Red Panel to FM, my primary oscillator width. So enough talking, just have a listen to the resulting sequence. I removed all of the effects to have just the pure perfect tone. So that's my sequence. It's pretty simple. The tempo is 138. You can hear the glide in between the notes, especially the higher note here. If I remove the glide, it doesn't have the same feeling. So that sound is actually the first oscillator in somewhat in between sine and so, with some FM modulation. This is just the pure tone without modulation, frequency modulation, but I prefer the tone with frequency modulation. Probably shouldn't have moved that knob. And then my modulator is in so wave mode, with a little cross modulation going on as well. Then I'm going into the dual 4-pole, and I'm not really using the high pass side, but I'm going into the high pass side anyway. I'm using the low pass side as a low pass gate. So as you can see, my filter is completely closed, and I'm opening this with the multi envelope. I'm using one output from the multi-envelope to open my filter, and if I manually open the filter, you'll see it's a drastically different sound. Because my envelope is pretty long, but I really like the plucky sound of the dual 4-pole when used as an RPG. Then it's a bit over the top, but I'm using the amplitude and tone controller as a simple VCA. I'm taking advantage of the multitude of outputs of the multi-envelope to take a different envelope to open my VCA, and then it's going straight into my scan and pan, and then straight into my Motu 16A interface. So that's the extent of the sound. Then there's a little bit of modulation through the sequence selector. So let's put that into focus. As you can see, I have two different signals going into the sequence selector, the reference output of the voltage multistage, as well as a random, which is a triggered random into the steps 1 and 4 of my sequence selector. The sequence selector is advanced by division of my incoming main clock. These two modulation signals are sent to an attenuator, my trusty Vermuna quadrupole, and this in turn is sent into the sustain stage of my multi-envelope. So up to now you couldn't hear it, but I just plugged the cable, and you can hear some modulation of my envelope when the sequencer selector reaches 1 and 4. It's not always the same modulation because this signal is not always the same. And of course, the envelope is going into the dual 4-pole, which is attenuated. So you can have a different effect on the low pass gate. And of course, it also impacts the envelope that's opening my VCA. So you can go have a very short plug sound to a longer sound. Once again, I love the dual 4-pole used like that. It's a very nice filter, but it's also a very nice low pass gate. And there's a little bit of resonance. You can of course increase it, but I prefer it here, because otherwise it loses too much bass information. Okay, so next up, let's see what kind of processing I've used, different effects I've used on that very synth line. So first of all, I guess the most obvious you can see here are the two different sends. Those are my Eventide H9 and El Capistan delay. That gives a bit of texture to the sound, but that's not the main delay here. I've used the FabFilter Timeless 3, which is a new one for me. I used to have a Timeless 2. I wasn't that fond of it and didn't use it that much, but someone over on Instagram recommended me Timeless 3 and forgot about it, then for some reason got it. It's really good, I must say. It became one of my go-to delays now. So I've used that preset, General Panned Filler, so I'll engage the delay now. And you can hear it's really panning the sound, but I've tweaked the preset quite a lot. So this is the pure preset, which I disengage, and this is my version of the preset. So it's much more pronounced. I've tweaked the EQ, really pushed the harmonics I like through, and I added some drive, lo-fi, diffuse. Beautiful delay. It's really expressive. You can modulate everything. Add modulation here, LFO, and apply the LFO or the envelope generator to whatever here. If you are used to modular, it's very similar, and it just sounds good, and it's beautiful to look at, and also I think intuitive, which I didn't feel like the previous version was. FabFilter Suite is always good plugins anyways, so yeah, very impressed with Timeless 3. Next up is track spacer. So you won't hear much here because it's sidechained with the kick. The kick isn't there yet. And next one is a basic Ableton utility bass mono, because as you saw, the Fab filter really pans everything left and right, and I really want my bass center, because as you will see later, this simple synth line has quite a lot of bass information which I'm gonna push afterwards, so I don't want it all over the place, I want it dead center. So once I've found something that I like on the modular, this would typically be where I bring in the drums. Usually I will bring the kick drum first, just a basic 4/4, in order to see how my sequence fits with the kick. Sometimes you need to offset stuff because the bass note hits on the same spot as the kick, or you feel like a 7-step sequence might work better than an 8-step sequence to give some groove. But here I'm quite happy with the sequence, so let's just bring in the kick. It's a simple kick, just a very little touch of harmonics, a short decay, a little EQ, some attack to have a click going through. But if we listen to it by itself, then next up we have a closed hat, which we have this pattern, just a tiny smaller non-accent note here. Another set of hats, the closed hat this time, a bit different, different accent here, just to spice things up. It is some noise from the internal engine here that is shaped into a hat with the internal filters of the Alphabase. It's not a sample. Next up we have another hat, which is this one, which falls on the kicks, and then there are some hits here and there just to give some groove. And also we have a ride, which I really like, to up the energy of a track, always works nicely. I'm filtering the low end with the internal filters of the Alphabase. So if we listen the Alphabase in isolation, contrary to usual, I didn't bring any processing into Ableton for the Alphabase, for the simple but very good reason that everything is happening later down the line into the Overstayer modular channel. So all the sounds here are dry. The Overstayer will do the heavy lifting. So let's bring back the synth. That's my beat, that's the sound. That's basically 90% of the track. So once I had the main synth line and the drums from the Alphabase, I wanted something that went in opposition to the very heavy sequence of the 158. I wanted something atmospheric or a little percussive, something that doesn't demand as much attention than the main synth line. So what I came up with is just a little strike from the DPO into the LXD, filtered by the Bandcamp filter processor, and this is going straight into my interface once again. Let's hear the sound. So it's DPO. There's just a simple 2-gate sequence out of 7 steps from the voltage multistage. So I'm sending the CV to the volt per octave. I'm just attenuating it into the quadrupole. I don't care if it doesn't follow volt per octave anymore. It's just a simple percussive sound. There is some exponential modulation, linear modulation from one oscillator to the next, a little following, but once again, it's not very important because it's just a very not tonal sound. One of the two notes has some pitch information, so they are not exactly the same. So the gates are sent directly to strike input of LXD, I'm using the final output, and then the LXD is going into the bulk filter processor. And as you can see, I only have 3 bands here, but I have 2 signals of modulation. So I kept these 3 bands just to have some sound going out in case the modulation doesn't open the bands. But other than that, there's a slewed CV random going into the center. So that's why this sled is moving back and forth. But the width is very low, so there's just 1 band lit at a time. If I remove these bands, you can see the modulation is just randomly selecting some bands, which you'll hear. And in order to hear more bands at the same time, you need to increase the width. The area that is selected is much wider here. I don't want to move that knob with my hand, so that's why I've used a quantized random from the random sampling to do that instead of me. So what we have is the different amounts of modulation here, as well as these 3 bands. And this makes the signal, so the signal is always a bit different. One thing to note is that since the quantized random are random with raw edges, it can get very clicky in the bulk filter processor, and it can create a lot of low-end information that you don't really want. That's going to just mess with your mix afterwards. And the only effect I'm using in Ableton is a FabFilter Pro Q3, just to cut below 200, just so I don't have these very nasty clicks. But I still get most of the range of the bulk filter. I'm also putting the bass in mono just in case, and this goes then into a gigantic black hole reverb with quite a pre-delay. This is a black hole plugin, and the preset is the dark matter. I could use my H9 pedal or my space pedal, but for this instance, it was much easier to use the plugin. So yeah, that's my atmospheric sound. This will get compressed and distorted through the Overstayer as well, and it meshes very nicely with the main synth line and the drums. Because there's lots of bass information everywhere in the tracks, I kept this one very higher register. So here's my pings, DPO. I find the DPO to be quite nice for atmospheric sounds like this. And even if it can go completely crazy with cross modulation, stuff like that, when you're just using a tiny strike, the advantage of it being crazy is that there's always a bit of a different tonality to your strikes.
So just a quick word about arrangement, because I feel people are going to ask about that. There's no grand scheme of things and important decisions taking place here. It's just very intuitive. As you can see on the screen, everything was played live once again. So even like the volume fades and breaks are mostly done within the Alphabase with the knobs. I tweaked the ride a little because I probably messed up my volume. But other than that, it's mostly really just feeling and playing and trying the track a few times and seeing what works. And the idea of playing your tracks live is that you're in the moment and you can feel like, oh, the hats are going to feel good when you put them there. But I don't really think about it. There's no like, oh, 4 bars, I need to bring in something. But usually I try to bring stuff in and out to keep things moving. So usually you can see this ride here finishing, so there will be the hat here starting. Sometimes it's nice to have a bit of a breather, so no kick, no hats, nothing, and then you can start again. The synth is on for the whole time, kick is mostly on for the most time. Hats are there for a while, then I guess the ride and the other hat are more like spice you add just to add some more intensity at some points. Bar filter is there at different volumes, but it's mostly there. Nothing special really. I don't think I'm the best person to talk about arrangement because my tracks are really, really simple. So that's the arrangement.
So now that we have all our elements together, this is where the magic will happen. Here are the sounds without the Overstayer and the Elysia box engaged. And now I've engaged the Overstayer. Granted, there's no gain staging. The Overstayer, the sound is going first into the Overstayer, then into the Expressor and into the X filter. The X filter and the Expressor are disabled for now. The sound is still going through, but they're in bypass mode. Even in bypass mode, the LEDs or the Expressor are still active. But let's focus on the Overstayer first. So I'll disable most of the Overstayer. So this is just the EQ and the preamps. So you can push the preamps. You can go just line input, which is going to be very low. Preamp, I'm not pushing the sound too much. You can go a bit crazy. But I like to keep it at mostly unity gain. I think unity gain is 5. You can always push it here and reduce the input gain afterwards. So what we're hearing here is just the dry sound and the EQ. But as you can see, the EQ, I've pushed a bit of presence around 6 kilohertz. I could push the bass here, but I think I will mostly push the bass with the X filter and the onboard filter here. So it's a high pass filter, but since it's resonance, I'm picking the resonance I want or the frequency I want to boost, and I'm boosting it with the high pass filter. So if you push it, it's going to cut the lows, but if you put it right where you want it, it's going to create a boost in the lows, which is going to be really nice. This is a low pass filter. Which I'm not really using, especially on a mix, complete mix like that. Like I said, I'm mostly using the presence EQ, just a touch of highs, but not really. I don't want my highs to be overpowering. You can choose 50 Hz, 100 and 300 for the bass, and 5K, 10K and 50K for the highs. But once again, lows and highs, I think the Elysia box will take care of it. Not that this one isn't good, it's great, but this one is a bit cleaner. I can push it. I don't know, that's how I work usually. Then the compressor, let's engage it. Usually anything past 5 goes a bit crazy. I've put the threshold so it doesn't compress too much. I want some compression, but I want a pumping effect, but I don't want to crash everything in sight. I don't want to destroy all of my dynamics, the beautiful dynamics of the Alphabase and the modular. So even if it's compressing quite a lot with the behavior, which would be a ratio that's quite high, I've backed down a bit the mix. So this is no compression. This is full on compression. And you can see the limiter is on when you go full on. So I'm trying to tickle the limiter really, just sometimes. And then I'm bringing the saturation. So the drive is about 6. This This is no drive. This is a lot of drive. And this is just a mass free. There's also the saturation. But yeah, usually just some saturation works nicely, especially since the makeup gain already saturates stuff and the preamps can saturate stuff. It's a whole mix, so I don't need to go too crazy. The compressor is very fast, so like I said, I want the pumping effect. This is more of a creative compressor. Even if it's on a whole mix, this is what's gonna give me the pump and the fun and the groove. I'm gonna use the compressor in the expressor to get a bit more tame, just to slightly cut the peaks, but the fun part is definitely this one. Speaking of the Elysia boxes, let's bring them in. Let's hit it like it says on the box. So first the expressor. It's quite subtle. The mixer at 50%, no gain. But you can crank it, but there's no need, because if you want to keep your overall mix at -6 dB at the end, then no need to push the gain everywhere. Threshold pretty low, or pretty high actually. Like I said, I don't want to crazily compress stuff. And this is more of a low compressor with a slow attack, slowish release, and ratio about 3. Since it's a whole mix and I want a more of a gentle compression, I've engaged the logarithmic compression. But yeah, and the high pass filter at 300 something. So the lows don't get compressed, or the lows don't trigger the compressor. And last in the chain, and not the least, the X filter 500. So like you can hear, it has quite a big impact, really pushing the bass, some passive massage to round up the highs. I'm cutting some of the mud around 300-400, and I'm pushing a bit around 10k for the hats. No need to go crazy once again. And also pushing around the same frequency as the presence for the synth, but not exactly the same. It really gives some low-end boost to the track. And the Elysia X Filter 500 is a beautiful piece of gear. You can really go crazy without distorting everything. And if we I'll remove the hats for a second. And just boost crazily the bass. But you can hear there's so much bass information here, and the kick and 158 synth line, which was just a synth line, is actually also a bass line. The low notes that were barely audible before, when you boost them with the high pass filter and the X filter, create this bouncy, groovy bass line that really works well. So this is too much, but that's just for demonstration purposes and show how just a simple synth line, if I had a bass line, like a different bass line, I would cut the lows from my first modular synth sequence, because there's a lot of bass information in there. Ideally, you tune your oscillator so that the notes without pitch information are in tune with your kick, and you can create this sort of ghost bass line in a way, because even if you were focusing on the high notes, the synth part of the sequence, the bass line is there. You just need to bring it out. So this would usually have been the end of it until I mistakenly ran the entire mix through the Overstayer once again, and I realized how good it sounded. So I adjusted a few parameters and purposely ran the entire mix through the Overstayer once again, because it picked harmonics that weren't there the first time, it pushed the bass a bit more, it added some drive and saturation, and just turn my simple sequence and simple drums into something much more gnarly and full sounding and just plain groovy and fun. So the Overstayer exists in some sort of VST form, in a bit more limited. You have the EQ, the drive, at least the mass drive is there, and I think the high and low pass filters are there as well. I think Softube does it. It's worth testing. Apparently it's pretty good. I haven't A/B'd software versus the hardware. I know these boxes are not easily available. Even just the Elysia stuff is very, very good, and usually everything you ran through it just sounds better. So I hope this breakdown from start to finish was interesting. Once again, a lot of the magic is in the processing rather than the sound, which are somewhat simple and very few. I'm not really one to have 64 tracks mixes. I think the modular allows you to reduce the number of tracks drastically just because it's just so full sounding. It's also my style, rather just minimal, I guess. So yeah, this is quite the quick and dirty process, very upfront track, which I've been trying to do recently because I've been listening to quite upfront techno like Sleep Archive and Kaiser and stuff like this. So yeah, this is nowhere near, but this is my try at it, and I hope you liked it. See you in the next video. Cheers.